Hello, my name is Alexis Ziegler. This is Chapter 6 of Integrated Activism, Wars That Were Never Meant to Be Won. So let's get on with it. So this book is about witch hunting, about how human societies assign evil or define evil and how they respond to it. These are Imbuti, hunter-gatherers, wearing somewhat modern clothing. Those are hunting nets that they're carrying. I don't actually know how old this picture is. But in any case, when you look at non-stratified cultures, relatively egalitarian cultures, they have a somewhat more egalitarian perspective on deities or spirits. They have a spirituality. They believe that there are spirits that live in the forest, in the trees, and the animals, and that human beings can communicate with them, struggle with them sometimes, but they do not have any sense of overwhelming supernatural evil. An omnipotent God or an omnipotent set of witches or devils that can dominate or control human beings. It's interesting, looking at Colin Turnbull's book, which is dated now at this point, written back in the 60s or 70s, about the Imbuti. There's a funny exchange that happens in that book between the Imbuti and the more settled agricultural communities around them. One particular story I'll relate. When the Imbuti, when Colin Turnbull was visiting him, he got to be friends with him, stayed with him for a long time. And they were visiting the nearby villagers, the agricultural villagers, the larger, more settled, more stratified, more male supremacist culture. And one of the elderly Imbuti died, an old woman. And for the Imbuti are a group of pygmies, although pygmies is a somewhat derogatory term for many people. So, in any case, one of the elderly Imbuti died, and for the Imbuti, they saw it as a natural death. He was old, the woman died, but the villagers, who were very meddlesome in Imbuti affairs, were were a culture, and you see this in many cultures around the world, traditional pre-industrial cultures that don't believe in natural death, that every death is human caused by a supernatural spirit. So they came to the Imbuti and said, wanted to do some rituals to figure out who killed this old woman. And the Imbuti got tired of it and said, screw you guys, we're going back to the forest. So they went back in the forest. So you see there an interplay between one group of people who doesn't believe that there is any supernatural that can kill human beings, and another group of people who believes that human beings only die through supernatural means. And that sort of belief in supernatural death is, when you see a lot of pre-industrial village-level cultures that are at war with each other, they believe in supernatural, that only human beings die from supernatural causes. This is something you see at least in a number of ethnographies. It's not certainly a worldwide phenomenon, but in any case, and then they often will use that as a justification or pretext for hostilities with neighboring villages or with outcasts within the group or among the village. So witch hunting, or assigning evil and then assigning there are witches or sorcerers who do evil things and then have to be deciding a group has to fight with them or has to overcome these supernatural evils. It gets manipulated and used by different groups for different purposes. This is an interesting group, Kaluli, a group in the South Pacific. And studying the ethnography of them, it's interesting. You see a lot of ethnographies, anthropologists, Western anthropologists almost always comment on how impassioned and expressive pre-industrial peoples are. Western cultures tends to be very reserved compared to other cultures. So that's true among the Kaluli. They're very expressive, passionate people. And they traditionally had a belief in witches that would do evil things, and those witches had to be reined in, corrected, dealt with. And how did they define witches? Well, they defined witches who were people who were too expressive and disruptive to the group and caused trouble for the group. And again, Colin Turnbull comments on this. We see witch hunting, that term, we tend to define it as a meaningless or pointless or politically motivated going after people who are not actually guilty of anything. That's kind of our definition, but I'm using a different definition here. I'm using the definition of simply assigning individuals within a group supernatural powers to do evil. And like I say, among the egalitarian groups, they simply don't do that for the most part. Among these village-level groups, they do it, but whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing gets really complicated. Colin Turnbull points out, and you see it with the Kululi, that they actually use it as a means of guiding behavior. So for the Kululi, they are very passionate, expressive people, but if they're too passionate, too expressive within a village-level culture, obviously it could cause a lot of conflict if people get too out of control. So people who get out of control, the rest of the group calls them witches and says, you've got to stop that. You're being possessed by some spirit. Make that go away. And you see that in a lot of these village-level cultures. They're kind of using this accusation of being a witch as a means of enforcing conformity or creating a group pressure for people to behave in particular ways. Now, whether or not that's good or bad, or what the trade-offs are if they did that or did something else, is a complicated subject. But it's interesting to understand that at the village level, at least, whether or not witch hunting is a bad thing or a good thing, it's a really complicated subject. But it is among non-stratified cultures. It is absolutely universal that there is some assigning of supernatural evil powers to other human beings and some efforts to counteract that. So this chapter is titled Wars That Were Never Meant to Be Won, and when you start looking at witch hunting, these are pictures, images, drawings from the Inquisition. We think of modern witch hunting, we think of people being burned at the stake, tortured. The Inquisition was a period of horrible class struggle, sort of getting ahead of the story there. But in any case, many thousands of people for several hundreds of years throughout the Inquisition were accused of witches, tortured until they named more witches, and then burned at the stake or otherwise executed. This happened in various nations around Europe, and with the Salem witch trials actually managed to transplant itself to the colonies in the United States to some extent. It's not surprising, and many people have pointed out, that most of the witches were female, they were poor, they were disempowered. The accusers would often accuse people with whom they had conflicts or with whom, for some reason, they had a vendetta. But it was a broader social institution. The inquisitors had the blessings, of course, of the Catholic Church. And it's interesting because there was a transition. Before the Inquisition, the Catholic Church was very clear that witches did not exist. But as the situation grew more dire in pre-industrial Europe in terms of poverty, in terms of just the struggling of people, the witch hunt rose up as a means to deal with class conflict. So let's read a somewhat lengthy quote here from Marvin Harris. The practical significance of the witch mania, therefore, was that it shifted responsibility for the crisis of late medieval society from both the church and the state to imaginary demons in human form. Preoccupied with fantastic activities of these demons, the distraught, alienated, pauperized masses blamed the rampant devil instead of the corrupt clergy and rapacious nobility. Not only were the church and state exonerated, but they were made indispensable. So that's a class conflict interpretation of the Inquisition, and I think it's largely correct. There's been some significant revision of the numbers since Marvin Harris was writing. He was writing back in the 60s and 70s, and now the number of executed people, by some estimates, has gone way down, but one has to wonder about who's making those estimates or what the basis of their information might be. But in any case, witch hunting is one face of class conflict in modern state-level societies or large state-level societies. And the other face of that class conflict is messianism, the assigning of peasant leaders to messianic status. And the period in which the early Christian period, when the Romans were battling the Jews, that was a period of very similar to the, quote, late medieval society. Strong class conflict. The Roman Empire was operating at the expense of the, quote, pauperized masses. And the pauperized masses were organizing and fighting back. And back then, and in Roman times, in medieval times, in modern times, what poor people do is they assign messianic status to popular, powerful leaders, and the state or the empire assigns, takes engages in witch hunting to try to divide the masses. So it's the two faces of the battle going back and forth. And it's interesting, the early images of Christ, they have this image, I think, on an earlier slideshow. Christ as emperor wearing military dress, crushing the serpent representing Satan. The early images of Christ are very militaristic. He was definitely seen, the symbolism of that time was definitely a military messiah. And that phrase, military messiah, you see it, or it's relevant to the early Christian period, to the medieval times, to modern. You see it now in movements in modern times in Africa, where you have populist leaders who are seen as messiahs, and they are military messiahs. They are guerrilla leaders. And it's funny because, I've talked to so many leftists, so many people who think they understand history, but it is so thoroughly buried in our history, and the evidence, such as we possess it, is so very clear that whether or not Jesus Christ per se existed as an individual or is understood as a composite of different individuals or different religious symbolism from that time, either way, it was a military uprising, a rebellion against the Roman Empire that started before the transition from BC to AD, and went on for a number of decades. The Jewish people organized themselves, and they fought a long, bitter, bloody war against the Roman Empire. There were waves of uprisings, and the Romans, in the end, the fighting was bitter even by modern standards. When they engaged in battle, they slaughtered people by the thousands. The final battle was at Masada. That battle is well recorded. And that's, when we speak of the Jewish diaspora now, the reason there is a diaspora is because the Romans got tired of fighting these recalcitrant Jewish people, and finally sent down enough legions down there to cut them to pieces, drive them to Masada, and then finish them off. And then they dispersed whoever was left. They simply drove them away and said, "You can't live here anymore." And that's the reason, that was the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, the spreading of the Jewish people around the different cities that then has gone on until modern times. And of course in modern times we have the reestablishment of modern Israel. But in any case, that was a very bitter military rising, and then several centuries after that period of uprising, the Jewish people in the early Christian movement were, tightly intermingled. It was the same group of people at that point. Were spread around various Roman cities and continued to associate with each other and continued to try to develop an ideology or to hold on to their beliefs that would identify them as a group. And there was a lot of pressure from Roman society to not make too much trouble. So the early military messianism of the Christian movement was converted into a pacifist messianism, and the early belief that individuals communicate directly with God was transposed or done away with, and the Catholic Church proclaimed that the Catholic leadership communicated directly with God. And if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's an interesting story there. When those were first discovered, there's a lot of material in there that points to this bitter conflict in the early religious groups between those groups that wanted to cooperate with the Romans enough to survive and give over this, okay, we'll let you have the Catholic structure and we'll operate under that and let you claim that you speak directly to God. And these more populist groups that said, no, we have the right to speak directly with God ourselves. Either group wanted to organize around religious means. That was just the way things were done. Long, bitter conflict between those two groups. And ultimately, historically, the centralized organizations succeeded. The fascinating thing about this is how all this history is simply unknown now. Even though it's very well recorded, it's not hard to find. But it serves so many purposes, even in modern times, to simply not understand the military messianic roots of the early Christian movement and the popular roots of wanting people who are opposing the centralization of the church. The thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls is the only people who were able to read those little bits of ancient script were religious scholars, and they had a very powerful motivation for not telling the entire truth about what was found in those scrolls. But there's been a number of books written about that, and you can find it in the footnotes to my book. So in any case, the the assigning the two phases of class conflict, witch hunting by the state and by the empire, and then military messianism arising up from the masses, has been going on for centuries. And here's some modern messiahs. One is Indian, one is African. These were seen as messianic leaders of divine beings by their followers. I mean, even going back to Roman times, the Caesars proclaimed themselves divine beings, but these were populist leaders. So let's take a skip and a jump forward all the way to modern United States. Here again, we're trying to sort of establish that there are patterns of behavior, or patterns, cultural patterns that go back thousands of years, and that it's not hard to find them, not hard to understand them, not hard if you're willing to step outside of our cultural constraints. And let's look at witch hunting in modern society. So this picture is an opium den. We're going to look at witch hunting class conflict in the United States. Let's start with the opium laws, which came into force in the recessions, depressions of the late 1800s. I believe around 1893 was pivotal depression in the U.S. In any case, opium had been tolerated, even encouraged for decades. Prior to that, a lot of Chinese immigrants came into the West Coast and were working until we have these waves of recessions, depressions coming in on the tail end of Reconstruction, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And then we see a lot of public discomfort, working class pressure against the Chinese immigrants. Working class people resentful of the Chinese immigrants. Now, of course, the Chinese immigrants were taking the worst low-paid jobs that most Americans, native-born Americans, didn't want. But nonetheless, it's not uncommon in times of depression or economic stress to see anti-immigrant attitudes arise. And then we see the anti-opium laws come into force. And there's a remarkable quote from a judge from the late 1890s. "Smoking opium is not our vice, and therefore it may be that this legislation proceeds more from the desire to vex and annoy the heathen Chinese and their respect than to protect people from the evil habit." He's talking about the banning of opium in the 1890s. And saying outright, this judge said, this is pointed at the Chinese people. The next drug war that we see arise in the United States is following fairly quickly on the tail end of the anti-opium laws, was in the context of the great campaign of lynching. There was a second civil war in the United States. The first civil war was fought between standing armies. The second civil war, African Americans moved into the politics in the United States in a significant way during Reconstruction. But as Reconstruction closed, the Ku Klux Klan and various other similar groups arose in the South and fought a bitter war, lynching blacks, trying to keep blacks economically segregated. And in this context, it was an anti-cocaine campaign. You see these images, and you notice how many of these images show an aggressive black guy going after a pretty blonde white woman. That was the image that was put out, that blacks were getting hooked on cocaine, addicted to cocaine, and then raping white women. Now, of course, the statistical evidence for that is non-existent. There were very few, if any, cocaine addicts among African Americans. Most ordinary African Americans simply couldn't afford it. But this image of the black rapist has been used many, many times to justify driving blacks out of the political process. Of course, this was done in the context of poll taxes and various other literacy tests connected to voting rights, to drive African Americans out of the legislative process, and also to keep them economically marginalized. We're talking about the creation of Jim Crow. So it was a very powerful witch hunt. Cocaine was used as the excuse, drug war number 2, to create the Jim Crow laws that lasted for so many decades. The third drug war was launched in the 1930s. Again, every one of these drug campaigns, most of them are connected with recessions, depressions. So in the Midwest in the southern Midwest in particular. A lot of Mexican immigrants had come up to help work on the farms. That was all fine and good till the Great Depression came along. And then again, we see very strong anti-immigrant sentiments arising. Here's a quote from a newspaper from that time. I believe this dates to the mid-1930s. "I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. While marijuana has figured in the greatest number of crimes in the past few years, so this public fervor was whipped up against Mexicans using marijuana as a pretext. Again, statistically unbased. No medical evidence that there was widespread marijuana use, and certainly no evidence that marijuana caused criminal or aggressive behavior. Nonetheless, many Spanish, Latin American, Mexican in particular, immigrants were driven back across the border. There was some forced repatriation, not widespread, but there was some simply loading people on trains and shipping them south in the context of the Great Depression. Drug war number 3. Drug war number 4 was a failed drug war. It was Prohibition, 1920s. You see in the lower right-hand corner there are a group of Irish immigrants. So to some extent, the Prohibition was a religious campaign, but it was also an anti-Irish immigrant campaign. People were, again, bitter about all these immigrants coming in to take their jobs. But the reason Prohibition failed, you see the upper right-hand corner, there are a bunch of middle-class people marching, saying, we want to be able to drink. So alcohol is statistically a much more destructive drug than opium, certainly the unrefined opium that was used in the 1800s. In fact, opium was normally used in the 1800s throughout the 1800s to get people off of alcohol, because it was known that alcohol was a more dangerous drug. But alcohol, by the 20th century, was widely in use among middle-class people. So it was a failed drug war. It was a drug war that rose up, but there were too many middle-class people wanting to drink, and Prohibition was set aside. So that drug war failed. The next drug war arose up in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, as the United States, the Civil Rights Movement rose up, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and again, the new drugs, LSD, marijuana is not a new drug, but in any case, there was a new drug war that was brought up in the 1960s to give some justification for some expanded military police pressure on popular movements on African Americans. So that's drug war number 4. Drug war number 5, we'll get to in the Reagan era. But it's interesting, a little side note here, that to look at the choice of drugs related to American foreign policy, in the 1960s, this is Vietnam Airlines, which is probably not fair to pick on them actually, but I just wanted a picture of an airplane with a bunch of people standing around it. But in the 1960s, 70s, when the United States was heavily involved in Southeast Asia, there was a lot of heroin coming out of Southeast Asia to the United States that the military personnel jokingly referred to the airplanes flying back and forth at that time as heroin airways, because there was so much heroin traveling on those airplanes. And with the I don't know about open, but in any case, with the direct involvement of a lot of powerful people in the American security and military establishment. And not coincidentally, these drugs ended up in American cities and had a deleterious effect on African American communities and working class communities. So if we look at the I guess, fifth drug war at this point, the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan came into power and slashed government spending, the inner cities began or accelerated a period of rapid decline. And who got blamed for it? The money managers. The money managers very purposefully. The runaway inflation in the 1970s left them shocked and unhappy, and they very purposefully pulled money out of the economy to pull inflation down, to pull wages down. It's a very systematic process. We talk about this in more detail in the book, but it was planned, it was intentional, it was purposeful. They have a name for the rate of unemployment they seek, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. There's an acronym for that, NAIRU. So what happens is when you have periods of high inflation, the NAIRU, or the need for employment from a purely crass economic perspective, goes up. And they also wanted to break the back of the unions, to to create a more favorable business environment, because the profit rate for businesses collapsed in the 1970s. So we see that coming together of things, a constriction of the oil supply, or the oil supply was unable to keep up with economic growth going into the early 1970s, the oil price shocks related to the political events in the Middle East, the Arab oil embargo. Even though the amount of oil restricted was very small, because the market was so tight, there was enormous price shocks. Union activity in the 60s and 70s were pushing wages up, so we have increases in commodity prices, increases in wages. We have runaway inflation, or high inflation in the 1970s, which trashes the corporate profit rate. The corporations get really unhappy about that. They get together, put Reagan into power, slash social spending, cut the money supply, drive interest rates through the roof, put the brakes on the economy to slow it down, to break the unions, to increase profit, and not coincidentally, to thrash inner city communities were devastated in the 1980s. But, the Federal Reserve doesn't get blamed for any of that. Those young black men, some of whom sold drugs, were blamed for it. So these guys get blamed for inner city decay when the decisions are being made by the money managers, the big folks at the top, the Federal Reserve, and those fellows. And not coincidentally, as UN foreign policy shifted from Vietnam and South Asia to Latin America in the 1980s, the choice of drugs in the U.S. shifts from heroin to crack and cocaine. Interesting book about this subject called Whiteout. So the CIA was directly involved. Various people in the federal government were involved in bringing heroin in from Southeast Asia, and then bringing in cocaine and cocaine products from Latin America. And, it was profitable to buy and sell those drugs. If they had a deleterious effect on the working class of America, that's fine as far as the money managers are concerned. So you can call it a great conspiracy. It's simply how class conflict works. And who gets blamed is the question we're looking at here. The 13-year-old drug dealer on the street corner gets blamed for decisions made by the chiefs of the Federal Reserve throughout the 1980s. Fascinating subject. So in modern times, we see in the 21st century an attempt again to demonize Latin American immigrants. And in an earlier chapter, in an earlier slideshow, we talked about the abortion debate, the right to life states, how the United States is kind of divided at this point into two Americas. Particularly since the Reagan era, there's been the coastal states, the wealthier states, economy has continued to grow, the middle class has continued to grow, wages have continued to grow, whereas a lot of the Rust Belt agricultural areas in the United States, wages have fallen, middle class has shrunk, economic growth has stagnated or receded. Those same states are the states where women have become more dependent on men, where women's economic role has declined. Those are the states where we see an accelerated or invigorated anti-abortion movement. In those same states is where we see the most aggressive anti-immigrant campaigns. So there you have it. Economic distress leads to anti-immigrant activity. People trying to deflect blame for social ills onto immigrants rather than looking at broader social policy. Now, it's an interesting subject, of course. Starting back in the 1980s, there was a rapid acceleration of the American prison population, the size of the American prison population. And it was already large, but it grew very rapidly through the 80s, 90s, into the 21st century. But now there's talk of drug reform and prison reform. This is a Mother Jones, recent article from Mother Jones, How Conservatives Learn to Love Prison Reform. After years of lock-em-up rhetoric, some Republicans are changing their tune. Now, this is a question I don't actually have an answer to, or not a good answer to. But, what's happening is Republicans and Democrats alike are looking at the cost of keeping all of these prisoners in jail and saying, wow, that's too expensive, let's do something else. And they're turning to more effective, drug rehabilitation programs and whatnot. And it's as if it was a new idea. Well, everybody's known for hundreds of years, and certainly for decades, that drug rehabilitation is much cheaper and much more effective than locking up drug addicts in jail, drug dealers or whatever. But the question, and the sad thing, is how little that part of the discussion, even among liberals, Even among educated people, people are simply uncomfortable talking about the class conflict aspects of these issues. But in any case, the balance is not of how much these things cost, but of how much those in power need or desire to restrain the working class versus their need or desire to not spend so much money. So in the early 1980s, when you had all of that radical organizing coming out of the 60s and 70s, and the money managers, the profit rate collapse, they wanted to put a lot of downward pressure on the working class wages. They badly needed a witch hunt, and they got it. They got a very big, powerful drug war that locked up millions of people. So what has changed? Why has the need to put pressure on the working class decreased in recent years? I'm not entirely sure. I know the crime rate has decreased some. Corporate profit rate is certainly much more healthy. The amount of resistance coming from the working class toward corporate profit is much lower. So maybe that's the answer. It would be interesting to look at the numbers around the crime rates and what's going on with that in recent years and try to figure out why this balance has shifted, where suddenly the need for the witch hunt is lower than it was 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't have a clear answer to that question, although I'm confident it wouldn't be that hard to answer it if you simply look at what's going on with the crime rate, what's going on with working class pressure to increase wages. I don't think that question would be terribly hard to answer, but that's how you would go about finding an answer. Looking at drug policy and how we're going to save money by letting people out of prison. I mean, we could have saved money in 1980 doing that. We chose not to. Why do we choose to do different things at different times? You have to look at the broader context, as much as we are not inclined to look at that broader context. All right, so the next few slides, I apologize, they're going to be a little tedious, but I think we'll make an interesting point here. So the objective, as best we can get at it, national or international effect of illegal drugs is a bit hard to quantify. It's interesting, I went back and forth with my editor a little bit in trying to come up with some numbers for how many people die from illegal drugs in the United States. You would think in this age of science and everything is statistically available, that number would be easy to come by. It's not. There are a number of contradictory numbers. Coming up with a clear number of how many people die from heroin, cocaine, the various illegal drugs. That number is, for all practical purposes, doesn't exist. Now, this particular chart is simply from Wikipedia. It's a global look at mortality. What do people die from around the world? Because the drug war now has gone global. We are supplying support to quote anti-drug efforts all over the world. Well, let's try to get some context here of, given this tremendous public attention that illegal drugs get, considerable public expenditure, let's look at, just very as quickly as we can, how illegal drugs fit into the risk of human health and well-being on planet Earth, in the whole world. So we're going to run down this whole list here. I'll go through it as quickly as I can. This list is in order of impact. So these are the biggest killers. So percent of deaths, here we'll pull out the little cursor here if it's going to work. So there's cardiovascular diseases and there's percent of deaths. Of course, all causes 100%. Now as we read through this, some of them are overlapping. Some of them are subcategories of other categories. That's just the way they organize the chart. So cardiovascular diseases is the single largest killer worldwide. That's a disease of the wealthy to a large extent, although to some extent it can happen among poor people too. But let's just keep going down. Infectious and parasitic diseases, that's the diseases of the poor. So the diseases of the wealthy and diseases of the poor are right next to each other. Ischemic heart disease, malignant neoplasms, cancers, cerebrovascular, that's a word I can't pronounce very well, stroke, respiratory infections, lower respiratory tract infections, respiratory diseases, unintentional injuries, HIV, AIDS, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. See, now we started out up in the high 20s percentage-wise. Now we're down below 5% of total deaths. All right, let's keep going. Perinatal conditions, digestive diseases, diarrhea diseases, intentional injuries, suicide, violence, war. This is an overlapping category with some of the others. Tuberculosis, malaria, lung cancer, road traffic accidents, childhood diseases, neuropsychiatric diseases, diabetes, hypertension, suicide, stomach cancer, diseases of the genitourinary system, cirrhosis of the liver, nephritis, nephropathy, Forgive me for the pronunciations here. Colorectal cancer, liver cancer, measles, violence, maternal conditions, congenital abnormalities, nutritional deficiencies, breast cancer, esophageal cancer, inflammatory heart disease. Okay, now we're down below 1% at this point. Notice 0.7. Started out at about 29%. So we're getting down to diseases that just are much, much smaller in impact. Alzheimer's disease, falls, drowning, poisoning, lymphomas, rheumatic heart disease, oral and or other cancers, fires, pertussis, prostate cancer, leukemia, peptic ulcer disease. Okay, now we're down below 0.5%, okay, down at 0.4%. Protein, energy malnutrition, endocrine disorders, asthma, cervical cancer, pancreatic cancer, tetanus, sexually transmitted diseases excluding HIV/AIDS, bladder cancer, meningitis, war, syphilis, neoplasms, iron deficiency anemia, ovarian cancer, tropical diseases, epilepsy. We're down near 0.2% at this point. Tiny little compared to that 29% we started out at. Okay, keep going. Musculoskeletal diseases, hepatitis B, Parkinson's disease, alcohol use disorders, drug use disorders. Whoa. Upper respiratory infections, urinary cancer, and that's the whole list. The list ends there with skin diseases, melanoma, hepatitis, whatever that, leishmaniasis. I'm not going to try to pronounce that one either. Benign prostatic hyperplasm, whatever that is. I don't even know. So, take a breath. Drug use disorders are pretty far down the list in terms of things that cause people to die worldwide. But that doesn't stop us from spending enormous amounts of money to fund anti-drug efforts all over the world. So the mathematics here are very simple. Witch hunting in modern, industrial, state-level, imperial societies is a process of class conflict. It is a process of putting pressure on the working class to drive wages down and keep corporate profit rates up. It is no more, no less. It has nothing to do with the actual harm generated by drugs. So what happens, we see the chart on the left. We've seen that chart before. The declining blue line at the bottom, that big blue, the lower part of the chart, is the cheap, easy oil, which is going away. We have more expensive oil coming into play, which drives up commodity prices. Other commodity prices, if you're building houses these days, work some in the construction trades, you know that lumber and plywood prices are through the frickin' roof. So, renewable resources are being overtaxed. Non-renewable resources are being overtaxed. Commodity prices go up. Poverty increases. That is such a tragic picture there of a child. The powers that be respond with drug wars, increased police military expenditures, and at least some of the working class responds with religious-based anti-imperial movements. I'm not going to try to justify or support or say anything good about the jihadi movement. That's not my battle to fight, and it's complex, but the point here is simply that it is, to some extent at least, feeds on class conflict. You would not have those quote-unquote extremists fighting against the Western powers if there were not such bitter class divides in the modern world. And, of course, that term extremist or terrorist or whatever, are the guys in the upper right terrorists or extremists, or the guys in the lower right terrorists or extremists? It's always depending on which end of it you're looking at. But in any case, class division breeds conflict. A little more than common sense, really. But class division, like sustainability, is an issue we just don't like to talk about very much. Which is as if we were trying to study physics, and we said, well, we want to study physics, we want to know how the world works, but quantum mechanics, that really makes me uncomfortable. And study of gravity, wow, that makes me uncomfortable too. And wow, relativity, boy, that, I just can't deal with that psychologically, emotionally. It's just too stressful. So, how much would we know about physics, about anything, if everything we tried to look at makes us uncomfortable? But that is exactly the case in the social sciences. Everything we look at is politicized. Everything we look at makes us uncomfortable. It relates either to sustainability or class conflict, ultimately. So much of the modern world does. And it makes us uncomfortable, so we just simply don't talk about it very much. And understanding witch hunting, if we want to understand what's happening going forward, The pressure on the quote-unquote terrorists will increase as commodity prices increase, as things polarize in the modern world. And they are polarizing. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, day by day. U.S. aid from International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement. This is focused on Western Hemisphere, Latin America. We see the millions and millions of dollars going into Colombia, Mexico, Haiti, Peru, Central America, Caribbean, Bolivia, Guatemala, Ecuador, Brazil, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Argentina. Although you'll notice Argentina down there at the bottom has discontinued their support from the United States. Billions of dollars spent in controlling international drugs. And you remember we went down that list where drug use disorders fell? Very, very low on the list of things that cause sickness and death for human beings, and yet it is the justification for enormous military and paramilitary expenditures all over the world, in Latin America in particular. We see these big beasts of machines that are purchased by local police force, supposedly to fight the narco traffickers and terrorists, and they are incidentally useful for fighting public protests, whether those public protests are for better wages or clean water or whatever. The lower left-hand picture there is actually from the Tampa police. Modern face of class conflict. It makes us uncomfortable, but if you want to understand human society, the science of human culture, you have to look at things that are not happy, not easy. So, I believe witch hunting is a pattern that happens all over the world. I believe it is identifiable. You see the patterns, even among village-level society. There's quite a bit of pattern behavior of, groups that just simply don't believe humans ever die from natural causes. They die from, only sorcerers can kill humans. Humans would live forever without sorcery and witchcraft. When you see a belief like that pop up in various places around the world, you say, oh, well, okay, there must be a consistent reason for that. When you see these drug wars in the modern times popping up in different countries, it's like, okay, well, there's a reason for that. That's the business leaders, the upper class, using a modern form of witch hunting to put downward pressure on the lower class. I personally think it's really important for us to understand this, because going forward, the witch hunts are going to get quite intense. They're going to be, and of course, they'll try to keep it as carefully organized as they can along class lines, because obviously, even dating back to the Inquisition, the powerful princes were never accused of being witches, only the marginalized. And in the Inquisition, as now, it becomes a very powerful tool. If you have effective popular leaders, all you have to do is accuse them of being a witch, accuse them of being a drug dealer, in modern times, or now accuse them of having some association with some terrorist group, and you have a socially legitimized means to put pressure on them or to kill them. Wars that were never meant to be won. It's important for us to understand the witch hunt, and we'll talk about what to do about this increasing class conflict as we go forward with the next slideshow. Thank you much. Have a good day.